We live in a world where people are constantly trying to prove something. And if you're honest, you've felt that pressure too, that quiet urge to explain yourself just a little more, to say one more thing so they understand, to hold on just a little longer so you're not misunderstood. But here's what most people never realize until it's too late. The more you try to prove your worth, the further you drift away from it. Not because you lack value, but because you've placed it in the hands of people who were never meant to define it. There's a deeper truth here, one the Stoics understood long before our world became this loud. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that a person's peace is shaped not by what others think, but by how firmly they stand within themselves. And yet today, so many people are trapped in a cycle of explaining, chasing, and seeking validation, believing that clarity will come from being heard, when in reality, it comes from knowing when to be silent. Because in this video, we're not just talking about silence as the absence of words. We're talking about silence as control, as discipline, as a form of quiet strength that changes how people see you, and more importantly, how you see yourself. This isn't about becoming cold or distant, it's about becoming clear. Clear about your values, your boundaries, and your peace. And if these conversations speak to something real in you, something grounded in truth, philosophy, and inner growth, consider subscribing. It's a small gesture, but it helps us reach more minds like yours, and it quietly signals that you're walking this path with intention. Hey, Stoic warrior, we live in a world where people are constantly trying to prove something. And if you sit with that idea a little longer, you begin to see how deeply it has shaped the way people live, how it quietly influences their choices, their reactions, even their sense of self. Because from a very early point, many people are taught that their worth is something that must be demonstrated, something that must be validated, something that must be recognized by others in order to feel real. And so they grow into adults who carry this invisible pressure, this constant need to explain who they are, to justify their actions, to make sure they are not misunderstood, to correct every false perception, to defend every decision. And over time, this becomes so normal that they do not even question it anymore. You can see it in the smallest moments, in the way someone rewrites a message before sending it, in the way they overthink a simple interaction, in the way they replay conversations long after they have ended, trying to find the exact point where things might have gone wrong. And in those quiet moments when everything slows down, there is often a feeling that rises to the surface. A subtle discomfort that is hard to describe, not loud enough to demand attention, but strong enough to be felt. A sense that something is off, that something about the way they are living is not aligned with who they truly are. And yet, instead of turning inward and exploring that feeling, most people respond by doing more of the same, by trying harder, by explaining more, by reaching out again, by chasing clarity from people who are not even clear within themselves, because it feels safer to stay in motion than to sit in stillness. It feels easier to act than to pause. It feels more familiar to speak than to remain silent, even when silence is exactly what is needed. This is where the deeper understanding begins, because silence is often misunderstood. It is seen as weakness, as avoidance, as something passive or empty. But in reality, silence can be one of the most powerful forms of presence, not because it withdraws from life, but because it chooses not to engage with what is unnecessary. It creates space where there was once noise. It allows clarity to emerge where there was once confusion, and it gives you the opportunity to observe instead of react, to understand instead of assume, to respond with intention instead of impulse. Epictetus taught that we are disturbed not by things, but by the views we take of them, and when you begin to apply this to your own life, you start to realize how often your reactions are shaped not by what actually happened, but by the meaning you assigned to it, the story you told yourself, the interpretation you created in your mind. And when you are constantly speaking, constantly reacting, constantly explaining, You rarely give yourself the chance to question those interpretations. You simply act on them, reinforcing patterns that keep you stuck. But when you step into silence, when you create that pause between what happens and how you respond, something shifts, because now you are no longer caught in the immediate emotional current. You are no longer reacting automatically. You are observing, you are reflecting, you are giving yourself the space to see things as they are, not as they first appeared in the intensity of the moment. And this is where many people begin to feel uncomfortable, because silence does not just reveal the world around you, it reveals the world within you. It brings you face to face with your thoughts, your fears, your attachments, your expectations, and for someone who has spent years avoiding that inner space, this can feel overwhelming. It can feel like something to escape from rather than something to explore. Yet this is exactly where your strength is built, not in the noise, not in the reactions, not in the endless explanations, but in the quiet moments where you begin to understand yourself more deeply, where you begin to see the patterns that have been guiding your behavior, where you begin to recognize the difference between what you feel and what is true. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself to look within, because that is where the source of strength resides, and when you truly begin to do that, you start to notice how much of your energy was being spent outward. How often you were trying to manage how others see you, instead of grounding yourself in how you see yourself. How often you were chasing approval instead of cultivating clarity. There is a certain freedom that comes with this realization, a quiet sense of relief that does not come from changing your circumstances, but from changing your relationship with them, because once you understand that your peace is not dependent on external validation, you no longer feel the same urgency to explain yourself. You no longer feel the same need to chase after understanding. You no longer feel the same pressure to prove your worth. Instead, you begin to move differently, not in a way that is dramatic or obvious, but in a way that is subtle and steady. You start to respond instead of react. You start to choose your words more carefully, and sometimes you choose not to speak at all, not because you have nothing to say, but because you understand that not everything needs to be said. This is where silence becomes a form of discipline, a conscious decision to hold your energy rather than disperse it, to remain grounded rather than be pulled into unnecessary conflict, to maintain your clarity rather than lose it in the attempt to be understood by someone who is not willing to listen. Carl Jung once said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, and when you think about that in the context of how much time people spend trying to be understood by others, it becomes clear how easily that privilege can be lost, because instead of becoming themselves, they become versions of themselves shaped by external expectations, by the need to be accepted, by the desire to fit into narratives that were never truly theirs. Silence allows you to return to yourself, to step away from those external influences and reconnect with what is real, what is grounded, what is aligned with your values. And as you do this, you begin to notice something else. You begin to see people more clearly, not through the lens of what they say, but through the lens of what they do, not through their explanations, but through their patterns. Because words can be crafted, they can be shaped to sound right, to create an impression, to maintain a certain image, but patterns cannot hide in the same way. They reveal themselves over time, in consistency, in behavior, in the way someone shows up when there is nothing to gain. And when you are constantly speaking, constantly engaging, constantly reacting, you often miss these patterns. You get caught in the surface level, in the words, in the immediate interaction. But when you step back, when you allow silence to create space, you begin to see more. You begin to notice who reaches out when you do not, who remains present when you are quiet, who respects your boundaries without needing an explanation, and this clarity can be both liberating and painful, because it often reveals truths that you were not ready to see before. It shows you where you were overgiving, where you were over-explaining, where you were holding on to connections that were not being reciprocated. And while this realization can feel heavy at first, it is also the beginning of something important. It is the moment where you start to reclaim your energy, where you begin to set boundaries, not through words but through actions, through the simple decision to step back, to disengage, to no longer participate in dynamics that drain you. And this is not about becoming distant or cold, it is about becoming intentional, about recognizing that your time, your energy, your attention are valuable, and that not everyone deserves equal access to them. It is about understanding that you do not have to explain your boundaries for them to be valid, that you do not have to justify your distance for it to be meaningful. There will still be moments where you feel the pull to return to old patterns, where you feel the urge to explain, to chase, to seek closure, and this is natural, because those patterns were built over time. They are familiar, they feel safe in a way that silence does not. But each time you choose differently, each time you choose stillness over reaction, each time you choose clarity over confusion, you begin to weaken those patterns and strengthen something new. Over time, this new way of being becomes more natural, more stable, more aligned with who you truly are. And you start to notice that your peace is no longer as easily disturbed, that your emotions are no longer as dependent on external factors, that your sense of self is no longer tied to how others perceive you. This is the quiet transformation that Stoicism speaks of, not a dramatic change that happens overnight, but a gradual shift that unfolds through consistent awareness, through intentional choices, through the willingness to sit in silence and learn from it rather than avoid it. And as this transformation continues, you begin to experience a different kind of confidence, one that is not loud or attention-seeking, but calm and steady, one that does not need to prove itself, but simply exists, one that is rooted in self-understanding rather than external validation. You realize that you do not need to win every argument, that you do not need to correct every misunderstanding, that you do not need to be seen in a certain way by everyone you encounter, because your value is not determined by perception, it is grounded in your own awareness of who you are. And this awareness becomes your anchor, the thing that keeps you steady when things around you feel uncertain, the thing that allows you to remain calm when others are reactive, the thing that gives you the strength to walk away when necessary, not out of pride or anger, but out of clarity. Because sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is not spoken, it is lived. It is the quiet decision to no longer engage, to no longer explain, to no longer chase, and in that decision, you communicate something far deeper than words ever could. You communicate that you understand your worth, that you respect your energy, that you are no longer willing to compromise your peace for the sake of being understood by those who are not willing to understand. And in that silence, you find something that many people spend their entire lives searching for, a sense of inner stability, a quiet confidence, a grounded presence that is not easily shaken, a strength that does not need to be displayed, because it is felt in the way you carry yourself, in the way you respond, in the way you choose where to invest your energy. This is the power of silence, not as an absence, but as a presence, not as a retreat, but as a return to yourself, to your clarity, to your values, to your peace. And once you begin to experience this, you understand why the Stoics valued it so deeply, why they practiced it, why they saw it not as something passive, but as something active, something intentional, something that requires awareness, discipline, and a deep understanding of what truly matters. Because in the end, silence is not about losing your voice, it is about finding it in a place where it cannot be shaken, a place that does not depend on others, a place that remains steady regardless of what happens around you. And from that place you no longer feel the need to chase, to beg, or to explain, because you realize that everything you were looking for outside of yourself was always within you, waiting to be recognized, waiting to be understood, waiting to be lived. And when you finally reach that point, When you finally step into that quiet understanding, you begin to move through life with a different kind of energy, one that is calm, grounded, and deeply aligned, one that does not seek validation, but simply exists in its own truth. And if you stay with that truth a little longer, you begin to see how deeply it has shaped not just behavior, but identity itself. How people slowly build a version of themselves that is designed to be accepted rather than understood, admired rather than authentic, validated rather than grounded. And over time, this becomes so familiar that they forget there was ever another way to exist, a quieter way, a steadier way, a way that does not depend on constant feedback from the outside world to feel real on the inside. Because the more you look at it, the more you realize that most people are not living from a place of clarity. They are reacting from a place of conditioning, from patterns they learned without questioning, from emotional habits that formed long before they were aware of them, and those patterns show up most clearly in moments of discomfort, in moments where they feel misunderstood, ignored, or rejected. Because in those moments, the instinct is almost automatic. To explain, to chase, to fix, to close the gap as quickly as possible so the discomfort can disappear. But what if that discomfort is not something to escape, but something to understand, something to sit with, something that is trying to show you where you have been placing your value, where you have been giving your energy, where you have been seeking something outside of yourself that can only be built within? Because when you begin to sit with that discomfort instead of reacting to it, when you begin to allow silence to exist without immediately filling it, you start to notice something subtle but powerful. You start to see the difference between what you feel and what is actually happening. You start to recognize how quickly the mind creates meaning, how it fills in gaps, how it builds stories that feel real but are often based on assumptions rather than truth. Carl Jung spoke about this when he said that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And when you reflect on that, you begin to understand why silence can feel so uncomfortable. Because in silence there is nothing to distract you, nothing to hide behind, nothing to project outward. You are left with yourself, your thoughts, your emotions, your patterns. And for many people that is unfamiliar territory. Yet it is in that space that transformation begins, not through force, not through dramatic change, but through awareness, through the simple act of noticing, of observing without judgment, of allowing yourself to see clearly without rushing to fix or control what you see. And as you continue to practice this, something begins to shift in the way you experience interactions with others. Because you are no longer as easily pulled into emotional reactions, you are no longer as quick to explain yourself, you are no longer as invested in being understood by everyone you encounter, and instead of trying to manage how others perceive you, you begin to focus on how you perceive yourself. This is where a different kind of strength starts to develop, one that is not dependent on outcomes, not dependent on responses, not dependent on external validation, but rooted in a deeper understanding of who you are and what you stand for, and this strength is quiet. It does not need to announce itself. It does not seek attention. It simply exists in the way you carry yourself, in the way you respond, in the way you choose where to place your energy. Marcus Aurelius wrote that you have power over your mind, not outside events. And when you truly begin to live by that principle, you start to see how much of your previous behavior was an attempt to control what was never yours to control. How often you tried to influence how others think, how they feel, how they respond, and how exhausting that process was, because no matter how much you explained, no matter how much you tried, you could never fully control another person's perception. And this realization, while simple, is incredibly freeing, because it allows you to let go of that burden, to stop trying to manage what is outside of you, and to redirect your focus inward, where your true influence lies, where your thoughts, your actions, your responses are entirely within your control. And when you begin to live from that place, you notice that your need to explain starts to fade, not because you have nothing to say, but because you understand that your words are not always necessary, that your actions, your consistency, your presence speak far louder than any explanation ever could. You begin to see that the more you explain, the more you dilute your message, the more you chase, the more you lose your position, the more you beg for understanding, the more you move away from your own clarity, and in contrast, the more you remain silent when it is appropriate, the more you hold your ground without needing to defend it, the more you allow your presence to speak for itself, the more you step into a kind of power that is not easily shaken. There is something deeply impactful about a person who does not feel the need to fill every silence, who does not rush to respond, who does not seek to correct every misunderstanding, because that kind of person is not operating from insecurity. They are operating from alignment, from a place where their sense of self is not dependent on external approval. And this is where people often begin to notice a shift, not just within themselves, but in how others respond to them. Because when you stop reacting in predictable ways, when you stop engaging in the same patterns, when you stop feeding the dynamics that once existed, the entire interaction changes, and sometimes this creates confusion, sometimes it creates distance, sometimes it reveals truths that were hidden before. Because when you remove your reactions, you remove the feedback loop that others may have been relying on, and without that loop, they are left with their own behavior, their own patterns, their own choices, and this can be uncomfortable for them, not because you have done something wrong, but because you have stopped participating in something that no longer serves you. Epictetus emphasized that no one can hurt you without your consent. And while this may seem difficult to accept at first, it becomes clearer when you understand that your reaction is what gives an event its emotional weight, that your interpretation is what determines how deeply something affects you. And when you choose silence, when you choose not to engage in certain situations, you are choosing not to give them that weight. This does not mean you become indifferent or detached from life. It means you become selective. You begin to choose what deserves your attention, what deserves your response, what deserves your energy. And in doing so, you create a boundary that does not need to be explained because it is felt in your actions. And over time, this selectivity becomes a form of self-respect, a way of honoring your own well-being, a way of ensuring that your energy is not constantly being drained by situations that do not align with your values. And as this becomes more natural, you begin to notice that your life feels different, not because your circumstances have changed dramatically, but because your relationship with them has. You feel less reactive, less dependent on external outcomes, less concerned with how you are perceived, and more focused on how you are living, on whether your actions align with your values, on whether your responses reflect the person you are becoming. And this is where the deeper transformation takes place, not in what you say, but in how you live, in the quiet decisions you make every day, in the moments where you choose silence over reaction, in the moments where you choose clarity over confusion, in the moments where you choose to walk away instead of staying in situations that compromise your peace. Because walking away is not always about giving up. Sometimes it is about stepping into something better, something more aligned, something more true to who you are, and this requires a level of awareness that cannot be developed in constant noise. It requires stillness, reflection, and the willingness to be with yourself without distraction. Friedrich Nietzsche once said that whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process they do not become a monster, and when you consider how easily people can lose themselves in conflict, in the need to prove a point, in the desire to be right, you begin to understand the importance of stepping back, of choosing silence when engagement would pull you into something that does not align with who you want to be. Because not every battle is worth fighting, not every misunderstanding is worth correcting, not every situation is worth your time, and the more you understand this, the more intentional you become, the more you begin to act from a place of choice rather than impulse. And this intentionality becomes your foundation, the thing that guides your decisions, the thing that keeps you grounded when things around you feel uncertain, the thing that allows you to remain steady even when others are not. You begin to realize that silence is not something you use occasionally, but something you integrate into your way of being, a quiet strength that supports you in moments of challenge, a steady presence that keeps you aligned with your values, a reminder that your power does not come from being heard, but from being clear. And as this understanding deepens, you no longer feel the same urgency to chase, to beg, or to explain, because you see those actions for what they are, attempts to control what cannot be controlled, attempts to seek validation where it cannot be guaranteed, attempts to fill a space that can only be filled from within. Instead, you begin to trust yourself more, to rely on your own judgment, to listen to your own intuition, and this trust becomes your guide, the thing that allows you to move through life with confidence, not the loud, attention-seeking kind, but the quiet, grounded kind that does not need to prove itself. And this is where you start to feel a different kind of peace, not the kind that comes from everything going your way, but the kind that comes from knowing that regardless of what happens, you will remain steady, you will remain aligned, you will remain true to yourself. Because in the end, silence is not about what you withhold, it is about what you protect, your energy, your clarity, your sense of self. And when you understand that, when you truly begin to live by it, you no longer feel the need to fill every gap with words. You no longer feel the need to chase after every unanswered question. You no longer feel the need to explain yourself to those who are not willing to understand. You simply live quietly, intentionally, with a presence that speaks for itself, with a strength that does not need to be displayed, with a clarity that does not need to be explained. And in that silence you find something that most people never fully experience, a sense of wholeness, a feeling of being complete without needing anything from the outside to confirm it, a quiet understanding that you are enough as you are, without explanation, without validation, without proof. And in the end, remember this. You were never meant to chase people just to feel valued. You were never meant to beg for understanding just to feel seen. And you were never meant to explain yourself just to feel enough. The moment you stop doing that is the moment you return to your power, not loudly, not forcefully, but quietly, completely, and without needing permission. If something in this message stayed with you, then don't let it fade here. Let it guide you. Let it shape the way you move, the way you respond, the way you protect your peace. And if you're ready to go deeper into this path, there's another video waiting for you on the screen right now that will help you strengthen that inner control even further. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being a part of Psychresto Mind.